Thanks again very much for inviting me. It was obviously not difficult to convince me to come here to Hawaii and talk. As you heard, I'm retired military. I retired about a year and a half ago after a 30-year Army career and took a job as faculty at the University of Nebraska. So I'm going to talk to you for a couple hours today, and my talks are designed to be a two-part series. So the first hour today is going to be deal with what is the problem, and then the second hour we're going to deal with what are we going to do about it. So right now I work at Nebraska. Nebraska looks like this about 3 days a year when the skies are nice and blue. If you put the Pacific Ocean in front of it, it would look probably a little bit like Hawaii. But I spent much of my career in the military at this institution, at USAMRIID, at the U.S. Army's Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And I still do a lot of work on their behalf. And my bosses at Fort Detrick insist that if I'm going to continue to work on their behalf, that I have to start every lecture off by reminding the audience that we are a unique national resource. So that's what we are, I guess. Most of you probably know us better this way, though. Dustin Hoffman left Fort Detrick about 20 years ago. I took his place, but unfortunately, Rene Russo left about the same time. I know a lot of people in the audience probably are ex-military or have some familiarity with the military. But even if you have no military experience, you probably understand that every military organization has to have a wiring diagram, and we're no exception. So this is our wiring diagram. USAMRIID is a basic science research institute, and it's organized along basic science lines. So we have a bacteriology division, a virology division, a toxinology division, etc. I was kind of the odd man out. I was the chief of the division of operational medicine. And we were the one division whose mission was not bench science. Rather, our mission was much more eclectic than that. We did a lot of liaison work. We worked a lot with the intelligence communities, with the CIA, the FBI. We worked a lot with the Centers for Disease Control. We worked with the various 50 state health departments. We did a lot of teaching, and it's really in that context that I've been asked to talk to you today. And my office is in the lower right-hand corner there. Every military organization also has to have a motto, and again, we're no exception. This is our motto: put the soldier first. And I'll generalize this, and I'll apply it to sailors, airmen, Marines, and public health officials and civilians as well. So any of you who wants to be first for any of our new experimental vaccines, please see me afterwards. We'll be glad to put you first. Our mission at Fort Detrick is, as you see here, it's to conduct research, to develop strategies, products, information, blah, 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 against those 15 or 20 infectious disease agents that our intelligence agencies perceive as representing viable biological warfare threats. That's where 90% of our research efforts go and where 90% of our budget dollars go. The other 10% of our efforts go towards the last part of that phrase, towards the study of naturally occurring agents of military importance that may require special containment. So, in that sense, for example, we do study Ebola at USAMRIID, not because we're worried that some bad guy is going to weaponize it and use it against us. In fact, Ebola, as for reasons I think you'll see as this talk goes on, really doesn't make a very credible weapon. On the other hand, we study it anyway, not because we're worried a bad guy's going to weaponize it, but rather because we occasionally send soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to Congo, to Uganda, to Sudan, to areas of the world where Ebola occurs naturally. And we're far more worried that they're going to acquire it naturally. Now, most natural infectious disease research is done outside of USAMRIID, but we have the BSL-4 level laboratories necessary to safely work with things like Ebola. So we do a little bit of non-biological warfare-related work. But again, 90% of what we do concerns those 15 or 20 infectious disease agents that our intelligence agencies perceive as representing viable biological warfare threats. And that brings us to the question, I think, what is biological warfare? Well, according to the definition we use in our treaty negotiations, it's as you see here. It's the intentional use of microorganisms or of toxins derived from those organisms to produce death or disease in humans, animals, or plants. Now, this would seem pretty straightforward, kind of a no-brainer definition, if you will, but I'm here to tell you that nothing about this topic of biological warfare is straightforward. And in fact, even the very definition has been the source of great controversy over the years. For example, the Soviet Union accused us many times of being our own worst violators of the Biological Weapons Convention because they argued that our use of Agent Orange in the jungles of Southeast Asia constituted anti-plant biological warfare. Now, we would say, no, Agent Orange is a chemical, maybe that's anti-plant chemical warfare, but it's not biological warfare. On the other hand, we accuse the Soviets many times of waging biological warfare in those very same Southeast Asian jungles chemicals by employing trichothecene mycotoxins, fungal toxins, yellow rain, if you will, against the Hmong sympathizers of the U.S. government in Cambodia and Laos. Now, the Soviets have never openly admitted doing that. But what they have said in certain quiet backdoor diplomatic sessions is, well, we didn't do that, but even if we did, we don't consider that biological warfare. We consider that chemical warfare. Now, we would say, no, those things come from fungus. Those come from a living organism. That's biological warfare. Well, I'm not here to argue who's right or who's wrong, just again to show you even the very definition has been the source of great controversy, and that's really complicated many of our treaty negotiations. I think there's the perception out there amongst most laymen and even amongst most of us in the military that biological warfare is something very new, the product of a brave new evil world, something we've heard a lot about since 9/11 and since the anthrax attacks of October of 2001, but something that really didn't exist to any great degree prior to that. And I'm here to tell you that nothing could be further from the truth. Biological warfare dates back a very long time, at least to 1346. And in 1346, a group of Tatar invaders were besieging the city of Kaffa, now known as Feodosia in the Ukrainian Crimea. And holed up within the city of Kaffa were a group of Genoese merchants. When the plague struck these Tatar invaders outside the city. Well, in frustration, they hit upon the clever idea of taking the dead cadavers of their fellow soldiers and catapulting them over the walls into the city of Kaffa in an attempt to induce a plague epidemic within the city. We now understand that that flinging of bodies over the walls was perhaps a clever idea, but it probably had very little to do with the institution of the plague epidemic. And in fact, there was a plague epidemic. The weapon worked as intended, if you will. The Genoese merchants inside the city got the plague. They panicked. They fled the city. They got on their boats, sailed back to Italy, took the plague with them, and from there the rest is history. That's how the Black Death is thought to have gotten its foothold in continental Europe. But again, that may have been a nice try, a clever idea, but it probably had very little to do with the institution of that plague epidemic. We now understand that plague is transmitted by fleas. And fleas tend to leave a body as soon as it cools a degree or two. So in all likelihood, those cadavers weren't even infectious when they were thrown over the walls. And the real reason people inside the city got the plague is probably the same reason people outside the city got the plague. We now understand those fleas are carried by rats, and of course the rats can freely burrow in and out of the city, but nice try nonetheless. Even in the United States, biological warfare is nothing new. It dates back a couple of centuries to the French and Indian Wars. And during the French and Indian Wars, Sir Geoffrey Amherst of the British Army was tasked with capturing Fort Carillon, now known as Fort Ticonderoga, from its Native American defenders. And he hit upon the idea of taking the scabs of smallpox victims, grinding these scabs up into a fine powder, placing the powder on blankets, probably actually had his sergeants doing all this for him, and then passing all those blankets off as gifts to the Native Americans. And in fact, history records that this worked as well. The Native American defenders of Ticonderoga succumbed to the smallpox, and Fort Ticonderoga fell to the British. So again, even the United States, biological warfare dates back a couple of centuries. In the 1930s and early 1940s, our intelligence agencies became aware of a very active Japanese program centered around a battalion known as Unit 731. And Unit 731 was operating in occupied Manchuria, and they were conducting experiments with at least 26 different biological agents on unwitting, unwilling Manchurian civilians. And as a result of those experiments, our intelligence agencies estimate that 270,000 Manchurian civilians died of what we would now consider biological warfare-related experiments. Well, in response to that very active program, the United States decided that it had better get into the biological warfare business as well. So in 1943, at Camp Detrick, Maryland, we established an offensive biological warfare research program. And it's interesting to note that that program was entirely offensive in nature for the first 10 years. And it wasn't until 1953 that we established a defensive medical countermeasures program that continues to exist until this day. In 1969, though, President Nixon unilaterally renounced the use of biological weapons. We can talk offline about why he may have wanted to do that. But he did that, and he ordered that our offensive program be disassembled and our stockpiles be destroyed. So for the next 3 years, from 1969 until 1972, we were in the business of taking apart our offensive biological program. And those efforts culminated in 1972 with us, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, signing the biological Biological Weapons Convention, whereby we agreed not to use, possess, stockpile, or experiment with offensive biological material. And since then, 140 other nations have ratified the Biological Weapons Convention. But the history of biological warfare since that 1972 convention is a litany of violations of the convention. And undoubtedly, some of the most egregious include the 1971 Uralsk smallpox outbreak. And that predates the signing of the Biological Weapons Convention by a year, but the Soviets were clearly in negotiations for that convention at the time that happened. And then the 1979 Sverdlovsk anthrax outbreak, and we're going to come back to those in great detail in a minute. And then on top of that, there are these lingering allegations that the Soviets used fungal toxins in Laos and Cambodia. And closer to home, there are a couple of high-profile incidents employing the castrobine toxin ricin. And the most notable of those occurred on the streets of London in 1978, when a Bulgarian dissident, an escapee from communist Bulgaria named Georgy Markov, was assassinated at a London bus stop. And his story goes something like this. He's standing at a bus stop, there's a crowd of people, he gets jostled, somebody pokes him with the end of an umbrella, mumbles a few words of apology, goes on their way. He went home, over the next few days became progressively more ill, and ultimately died. A few weeks later, another Bulgarian dissident living in Paris, France, heard about Markov's plight. And he thought back and, something like that happened to me. But obviously he hadn't died, but he had been poked with an umbrella. So he went to his doctor, and at the site where he had been poked, they were able to dissect out this tiny little titanium pellet with some wax plugs in it. And the wax was designed to melt at body temperature, but why it didn't in his case, I don't know. But anyway, the pellet was filled with ricin toxin, and so they exhumed Markov's body and did an autopsy on him, and sure enough found the same thing. And then closer to home, in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C., there was a third episode involving a Soviet dissident, and all told, the CIA feels that there were probably at least 6 of these kind of Maxwell Smart type spring-loaded umbrella gun assassination attempts against Soviet and Bulgarian dissidents using ricin as a weapon. So these 4 incidents, the Uralsk and the Sverdlovsk incidents, which we're going to come back to again in a minute, the Yellow Rain allegations and the ricin crimes, are really all we have as far as, or almost all we have, as far as real state-sponsored Cold War-era biological warfare. And I would argue that even none of those rises to that, because the first 2 were accidents, as you're going to see. The Yellow Rain allegations have never been proven. And the ricin assassinations, I think most of us might consider crimes, but I doubt most of us would consider that rises to the level of open warfare. But nonetheless, that's really about all we have in terms of real state-sponsored Cold War-era biological warfare. On the other hand, we have hundreds of examples of nutcases trying to use infectious diseases as weapons of terrorism. And that brings up the dichotomy between these entities of biological warfare and biological terrorism. And there certainly are some similarities, but there are very critical differences as well. And I think those will become clear as these talks go on. And I'll kind of dispense with the issue of biological warfare in the first 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about biological terrorism, which is unfortunately, if you ever have to deal with this, probably the form of this that you're going to have to deal with. All right, so I said I would come back to this. So in 1971, 35 years after smallpox had been eliminated from the Soviet Union, there was an outbreak of smallpox in the Kazakh city of Uralsk. So Kazakhstan is now an independent country, but was one of the republics of the Soviet Union. And the Aral Sea there, which is incidentally one of the world's biggest ecological and public health disasters. The Aral Sea straddles the borders of what are now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And at the time, there was a city called Uralsk on the shore of the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan. It's now 50 miles from the shore because the lake is drying up and very polluted, and the rivers have been diverted that supply it and stuff. But back then, it was a seaport on the Aral Sea. there was a scientist, a biologist, who was studying fisheries biology on the Aral Sea. And she was on a month-long scientific expedition, and she finished her studies of whatever fish she was studying and put into port in her hometown of Aralsk. The next day, she came down with smallpox. And before it was over, there were 9 other people, total of 10 cases, 9 other people who had caught smallpox from her. So of those 10 cases, 3 died, which is 30%. That's kind of the normal quoted mortality rate of smallpox back in the day when smallpox roamed the earth. But there was something very different about this outbreak. First of all, the 7 people who didn't die had all been vaccinated, so they shouldn't have gotten smallpox at all. Only 3 people who died, who hadn't had smallpox, are the 3 who died, and they died of what would have been considered a very, very rare form of smallpox, hemorrhagic smallpox. So the question is, 35 years after this disease was eliminated from the Soviet Union, where did it come from? Well, the supposition is that it came from Vaz Island. So there's an island in the middle of the Aral Sea called Vozrozhdenia Island, Resurrection Island, and we know that it was the Soviet biological warfare proving grounds. And so the supposition is that an experiment went very wrong and smallpox was released into the air. And again, we worry that the 7 people who got sick had been vaccinated. The 3 people who died of this very rare form of smallpox, which raises questions: could this have been genetically manipulated? Now, back in 1971, our knowledge of molecular biology and genetic manipulation would have been in its infancy, so some people might argue no, but obviously a very scary proposition here. And the question remains, is smallpox still there? We know that anthrax is. And so we very much fear that smallpox might be too. I said I would come back to this incident as well. So in April and May of 1979, intelligence reports began to filter out of the former Soviet Union that spoke of a large number of human anthrax casualties in and around the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk. And at first, of course, the Soviets denied this completely, but as intelligence data continued to mount, they finally did admit that, okay, we have a problem with human anthrax in Sverdlovsk, but we've conducted an investigation. We've gotten to the bottom of it. And the explanation they offered was that a couple of butchers had slaughtered some contaminated cattle and had distributed the meat from those cattle to the citizens of Sverdlovsk on the black market, and those citizens had contracted gastrointestinal anthrax from consuming that contaminated beef. And oh, by the way, they deserve it anyway, because they're not supposed to be buying their meat on the black market. And they even went so far as to send a Soviet scientific delegation to the United States in 1988. And that delegation attended 3 American scientific conferences, and they presented their data in abstract form. They actually admitted to having 96 cases of human anthrax, 79 of which they showed pretty good evidence for being gastrointestinal in nature. And so I think most of us in the American scientific community bought off on that for a while. But unfortunately for them and for us, intelligence data continued to filter out, ultimately including autopsy data. So there were a couple of, I would argue, very brave Soviet pathologists who had been assigned to autopsy the Sverdlovsk victims. And they autopsied 43 of the 66 known victims, and they were supposed to turn their autopsy reports into the KGB, which they did. But they made duplicate copies, and those duplicate copies ultimately found their way into the hands of the CIA. And those autopsy reports demonstrated that every last one of those patients had died of what looked like anthrax of the chest, not the type of anthrax that you would expect to see, not gastrointestinal anthrax, not the type you would expect to see if this were contaminated beef either. And then finally in 1992, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin admitted that, well, perhaps military developments played a role in that outbreak. And then he shut up, and that's all the Russians have ever had to say on the record about that. But basically, Boris Yeltsin ought to know, because back in April of 1979, he was the local Communist Party commissar for the Sverdlovsk Oblast. Well, after he made that admission, he actually allowed a team of American epidemiologists into Sverdlovsk, and that team was chaired by Professor Matt Messelson at Harvard. And Messelson and his group went in, and they did a very simple but very elegant epidemiologic investigation. They discovered there was a Soviet military base, Compound 19, in the city center of Sverdlovsk. So they took a map, and they plotted the location of the victims' houses on that map, and that plot followed a very nice and very narrow straight line, starting at Compound 19 and emanating to the southeast. If you look at Sverdlovsk airport meteorologic data for the 2nd of April of 1979, the date of the purported release, the wind's blowing to the southeast all day. So not the type of epidemiology one would expect to see if this were contaminated beef either. To make a long story short, there was a 6-story building on Compound 19 dedicated solely to the production of offensive anthrax weapons. And what had happened was somebody had taken the filters out of the production stack and forgot to put new ones back in. So for the entire night shift that night, live anthrax spores were vented into the air of the city of Sverdlovsk. We are aware of at least 2 other similarly sized anthrax facilities in existence in the Soviet Union at that time. And if you include all biological weapons, we're aware of at least 19 offensive weapons production facilities in existence in the Soviet Union in 1979, 7 years after they signed the Biological Weapons Convention. So where does that leave us today? Well, in 1925, the first of the Geneva Protocols was promulgated. And this Geneva Convention, in the minds of some people, should have prohibited the use of offensive biological material. And I say in the minds of some people because it really doesn't address biological weapons directly. What it does say is that states parties agree not to use weapons that pose an undue risk to the civilian population. And because some biological weapons are contagious, that was interpreted as including biological weapons. But as you're going to see, the vast majority of biological weapons are actually not contagious. Not that I'm advocating for offensive biological warfare, obviously. But it was a moot point anyway, because the United States was not a signatory to that convention. In 1969, though, Richard Nixon renounced the stuff anyway. In 1972, we signed the BWC. And then finally, on their 50th anniversary in 1975, the United States did ratify the then 4 Geneva Conventions. And both of those last 2 documents govern our national policy today. So what is that policy? Well, we won't use this stuff under any circumstance, even in retaliation. We certainly reserve the right to retaliate with other things, but we won't retaliate with biological weapons. The research we do at Fort Detrick and elsewhere is limited strictly to the development of defensive and medical countermeasures. And if you believe your government, we possess no weaponized biologicals. And the U.S. government... And the U.S. government actually went to great lengths to try to convince a skeptical press and public that, in fact, that really was the case. The public was skeptical even back then. But to convince the public that, in fact, we really were serious and we really were getting rid of our offensive biological capability. So when we did the destruction between 1969 and 1972, we invited reporters to come and write about it. We invited Democrats and Republicans to come and watch the process. And we invited supervision from the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and the Departments of Natural Resources of those 3 states. And that's because those are the 3 states where the stockpiles were held. So again, the U.S. government went to great lengths to try to convince a skeptical press and public that we were really serious about this and really were getting rid of our offensive biological capability. I think for us, though, in the medical and public health and preparedness communities, it's very instructive to look at what was in that arsenal before we got rid of it, because that should give you a good idea of what Uncle Sam thought made a credible threat. Probably the same thing that bad guys are going to think make credible threats as well. So before we started getting rid of these things, we actually had 10 offensive weapons systems in our arsenal, and they can be divided into 7 anti-personnel systems and 3 anti-crop systems. So we had 3 lethal, and the anti-personnel systems can be further subdivided into lethal and incapacitating agents. So we had 3 lethal agents in the arsenal: anthrax, botulism, and tularemia. We had 4 incapacitants: brucella, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, staphylococcal enterotoxin B, and Coxiella burnetii, the causative agent of Q fever. And then perhaps more interestingly, we also had 3 anti-crop weapons in the arsenal. We had a fungus known as wheat stem rust, whose target was the wheat fields of the Soviet Ukraine. And we had a spore known as rice blast spore, whose target was the rice fields of South Asia. So again, I think very instructive to look at what Uncle Sam thought made a good weapon probably the same thing that bad guys will think make good weapons as well. But in the medical world, of course, we're always interested in a second opinion. So for a good second opinion of what makes a credible threat, let's go right to the horse's mouth. So the Soviet Ministry of Defense actually had a very elaborate scoring system for rating potential biological weapons. And they gave points based on stability in the atmosphere, reliability, aerosolization ability, et cetera. And they ordered that any agent with a score of 15 or greater on this somewhat arbitrary scoring scale be pursued for weaponization. So here's a list in order of those agents deemed worthy of weaponization by the Soviet Ministry of Defense. And I think you can see that the first several agents on this list overlap pretty nicely with what was in the American arsenal, with two very important exceptions. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, when you start getting further down the list, you get to Marburg, and no weapon would that really be? I personally, Marburg would certainly, which Marburg's a close cousin of Ebola, it would certainly be a great terror weapon. If you're the first terrorist on your block to have Marburg agent, then you have a lot of street cred out there. But it's not a very good weapon against well-prepared troops on the battlefield, certainly. And the same could be said for a lot of those. But just for this, I don't know what I did to, okay. So just for the sake of argument, though, I think most of us would have to agree that at least the first several agents on this list make pretty credible threats. Both superpowers during the Cold War thought so. Now, I said there were two important exceptions to this overlap, and those exceptions are the first two. So smallpox and pneumonic plague obviously factored very prominently in Soviet plans, and yet we never weaponized either of those agents. And why is there's one critical difference between those agents and the next several. I assume some people have picked up on it already. But those two are contagious. So plague is contagious. Smallpox is contagious. The next several are not. Anthrax is not contagious from person to person. So when I'm working with the young medics out on the battlefield, the way I'd put that to them is, look, if you're sitting there and the aircraft flies overhead and, you get caught in the cloud, you're in big trouble. On the other hand, if I'm asking you to take care of anthrax patients over at the battalion aid station, you're at virtually no risk of contracting anthrax from your patients. And the same can be said for botulism in Venezuela, and equine encephalitis, and tularemia, and Q fever, and many of the other agents that most experts feel make credible threats. But the two big exceptions are smallpox and plague. So why did we choose not to weaponize those, and yet the Soviets did, and they factored very prominently in Soviet plans? Well, I think to get to the bottom of that, you have to look at how we viewed these agents. So the United States, if you are as old as I am, if you'll recall back to the height of the Cold War, we were fighting a theoretical battle called the Fulda Gap scenario. And the Fulda Gap is a gap in the Sudeten Mountains near where the East German, West German, and Czechoslovakian borders used to intersect. And it was always assumed that if the Soviets ever got serious about overrunning the Western democracies, that they would have to come through the Fulda Gap. So in order to guard against that possibility, we stationed 3 American divisions in Germany to guard the Fulda Gap. Well, arrayed against those 3 American divisions were 236 Warsaw Pact divisions. So clearly we were going to be little more than a speed bump if the Soviets ever got serious about this. And so what we did, and this obviously isn't polite cocktail party conversation, but what we said in kind of quiet backdoor sessions with their diplomats is, look, if we ever feel that our national identity is at stake, the future of Western democracy is at stake, our backs are up against the wall, we reserve the right to pull out these weapons, and we're going to use them on the battlefield. But our troops occupy that same battlefield, so we're going to be in contact with those enemy soldiers, and we don't want something for that reason that's contagious from person to person. So we saw that's, in military speak, we refer to that as operational context or operational weapons. So we saw them operationally. The Soviets, on the other hand, did not see these as operational weapons. They saw them as strategic weapons. So their intent was not to use them on the battlefield at all, but rather to put them into intercontinental ballistic missiles and launch them overseas. And in fact, at any one time during the height of the Cold War, the Soviets had 120 missiles in silos loaded with live smallpox aimed at 5 American cities: New York, Washington, Houston, Seattle, and Los Angeles. And the goal there was to hit American coastal coastal cities, and then count on the contagious nature of these agents to spread across the American continent. The idea not being to affect soldiers on the battlefield at all, but rather to decrement the American civilian population's desire to support any war against the Soviet Union. But when you correct for that difference in philosophy, again, the Soviets saw them strategically, we saw them operationally, I think most of us, I think you can take it to the bank, that at least the first several agents on this list make very, very credible weapons threats. So now let's shift gears a little bit and let's start talking about the threat more specifically. But before we do that, I think we need to have a classification scheme in mind to talk about these weapons. We can classify these weapons in one of several ways. We can classify them according to type, and when we do that, we can speak of pathogens, which are living, replicating things, viruses and germs, if you will. We can speak about toxins, which are the chemical byproducts of living things, and it's the fact that they come from living things that differentiates them from chemical weapons. And we can even speak about biomodulators. And that's a concept that, to our knowledge, has never left the drawing board, but I think it's fascinating to look at where research was headed and probably still is headed today. So during the height of the Cold War, there was a Soviet program aimed at weaponizing various cytokines, the idea being blow them out there on the battlefield and influence your physiology. In fact, there was a specific program that looked at weaponizing delta sleep-inducing peptide, the idea there, I think, being pretty obvious, and a program aimed at weaponizing substance P, one of the neurotransmitters by which you perceive pain. We can classify these things according to their use, and today we're speaking mainly of anti-personnel agents, but there certainly is historical precedent for the use of anti-animal weapons in warfare as well. So, for example, in 1915, before we were actively involved in World War I, we were supplying horses to the French cavalry, and there's good evidence that German agents gained access to the ports of Baltimore and New York and infected some of those horses with glanders. We've already talked briefly about anti-plant warfare. I mentioned the wheat stem rust and the rice blast spores, and I'll close today in about this first lecture in about half an hour from now with a very frightening example of potential anti-plant warfare. And then finally, there's this concept of anti-materiel warfare, and that's another one that, to our knowledge, has never left the drawing board, but again, I think fascinating to look at where some people were headed with this. So during the heyday of the Soviet Union, there was a Soviet program that was looking to develop a bacterial strain that would feed on rubber. And I always hold out to my Navy colleagues. Imagine the problems you could cause for the Navy if you had a bacteria that would rapidly destroy the seals and gaskets on ships, for example. And then there was another program, I don't think this program ever got very serious, but there was actually talk of trying to develop a bacteria that fed on canvas. And I hold out to my Army, imagine the problems you could cause for the Army if you had a bacteria that would rapidly destroy canvas. And then finally, I hold out to my Air Force. Imagine the problems you could cause for the Air Force with some of these anti-plant weapons on putting greens and fairways. I think for us, that always gets a laugh. So I think for us, though, in the medical, public health, and preparedness worlds, it's most useful to consider these things operationally. So when we do that, we can speak about lethal versus incapacitating agents, pretty straightforward concept. And then we can speak about transmissible versus non-transmissible, or contagious versus non-contagious pathogens. And if there's any good news about this whole deal about biological warfare, it concerns the fact the vast majority of good weapons are actually not contagious person to person. So that's all I can say as far as good news. All right, so we're going to switch gears now and start talking about the threat specifically. So we're going to talk about the threat on three levels. We're going to talk about the strategic threat, the tactical threat, and the terrorist threat. And I'll dispense with the first two of these pretty quickly, and then we'll spend the rest of this hour and the whole next hour talking about bioterrorism. So what do I mean by the strategic threat? I think most of you in here probably know what I mean by that, but the way I put it to layman is, what would the Albanian Minister of Defense think makes a credible weapon? His goal is to win the war, to alter the course of global politics. So what would help him do that? Well, if you look at it from that perspective, the news for us as public health planners and preparedness planners is actually pretty good, because there are very few agents that have all the necessary characteristics, the downwind drift capacity, the resistance to infrared degradation, the aerosol stability, etc., necessary to make them large-scale viable strategic weapons. So that list might include anthrax, might include smallpox, but it probably includes very little else. And I think with a little bit of work, in fact, I think we're almost there already. We're going to have effective medical countermeasures for everything on that very short list. So the Strategic National Stockpile now has enough anthrax treatment, enough smallpox vaccine for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Now, that's not to say there won't be problems. There'll be logistic problems getting it out there in time, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we've made a lot of progress, and again, I think it's a very short, finite list that we're eventually going to be able to successfully tackle. Now, when you switch gears and start talking about the tactical threat, what do I mean here? Well, again, I think most of you know what I mean, but the way I put it to layman is, what would the Elbonian lieutenant colonel think makes a good weapon? His job is not to win the war. His job is to take that hill. So what would help him do that? Well, if you look at it from that perspective, the news gets a little bit more difficult, because now some of the toxins like botulinum toxin and staphylococcal enterotoxin, which would not have been stable enough to be used on a strategic level, might at least persist in the atmosphere for a couple of minutes, allow their use on a small point target or a single room in a building or whatever. But still, that list is probably 7 or 8 agents long. And still, I think we're going to come up with effective medical countermeasures for everything on that list. In fact, I think we're getting close to that even. Now, just as an aside, most military planners would argue that biological weapons never make good tactical weapons. And why is that? Well, it's because biological weapons have one very important characteristic that conventional chemical and nuclear weapons don't have, and that's an incubation period. So there's a delay between the time I release my weapon and the time I see its effect, and that delay can vary from several hours in the case of a heavy staph enterotoxin attack to several weeks in the case of brucellosis or Q fever. But for most of these agents, it's on the order of several days. Well, if my boss tells me to take that hill, I probably don't want to throw my weapons at that hill and then wait around for 6 or 7 days waiting to see if they're going to have their effect. So in that sense, again, I think most military planners would argue that these things never make good tactical weapons. And in fact, Soviet doctrine never called for their tactical use. But even if you could envision a tactical use for them, that list is very finite. Now, when we switch gears and start talking about the terrorist threat, I'm here to tell you that our problems become pretty immense. So we in the military have the easy job. We have to deal with the strategic and the tactical threat. And it's you in the public health and preparedness community that have the more difficult task of dealing with the terrorist threat. I think to understand the terrorist threat, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the average terrorist seeking? Well, in some cases, it may be truly strategic goals. You know, presumably Al-Qaeda and ISIS really do want to dominate the world. They have strategic goals, but the good news for us is if they intend to achieve those goals using biological weapons, they're pretty much stuck with the anthrax and smallpox that we already talked about, and we've got decent countermeasures for those. On the other hand, the goal of many terrorists is much more mundane than that. Many terrorists are simply seeking publicity for their cause. And I'm here to tell you that if that's all I'm after, then almost anything makes a credible weapon. Let's look at a few examples of that. So this is downtown Antelope, Oregon, population 45. This is most of the rest of the town of Antelope. Before I go, do I really only have a few minutes left? Because 10:15. Okay, good. I was starting to get nervous there. So this is most of the rest of the town of Antelope, and I don't know how many of you remember this story, but I'll refresh your memory. So back in 1984, an Indian holy man named the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his band of followers, the Rajneeshis, moved into Antelope. There were more than 45 of them, so in free and fair elections, they soon gained control of the town government, changed the name of the town to Rajneeshpuram, much to the chagrin of the local ranchers. And if their ambitions had stopped there, we might not have heard much more about them. But unfortunately for them and for us, their ambitions didn't stop there. So they wanted to take control of the entire county. So the goal, the plan they came up with that was going to enable them to do this was they're going to poison everyone else in the county on election day so they can't go to the ballot box. So 6 weeks prior to the election, they decided to conduct a test of concept of their ability to do this. So they went to the county seat of the Dalles, Oregon. They went to 10 restaurants in the Dalles. They took a vial of salmonella cultures and they sprinkled all the items at all the salad bars in these 10 restaurants with salmonella. Now, we in the military would consider this a tactical victory for them, but a strategic defeat. A tactical victory victory because, in a sense, the weapon worked as intended. 751 people became clinically ill with salmonellosis. A strategic defeat because they didn't win the election anyway. But here's a group that was able to use an agent, salmonella, that we in the military would not have considered a credible weapon. But yet they used it anyway. And I think you could see if you could use salmonella in that regard, you could also use Shigella and Campylobacter and Yersinia and hepatitis A virus and Listeria and probably any one of about 150 to 200 other pathogens that you could find in almost any hospital clinical laboratory. So when we start talking about defending against that kind of threat, I think you can see our problems become much greater. I think an even better example, though, of the nature of this terrorist threat comes from considering the B'nai B'rith incident. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but I'll refresh your memory. In April of 1997, a postal clerk working in the mailroom at the B'nai B'rith headquarters, Jewish organization headquarters, in downtown Washington, came upon a package, and this package was dripping with red liquid. And he opened the package. Inside's a Petri dish, a blood agar plate labeled anthrax, misspelled, but anthrax nonetheless. Well, this postal clerk did exactly what he was supposed to do. He called the FBI. And the FBI came, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They secured the package, and they took it 30 minutes up the road to the Naval Medical Research Institute at Bethesda. And the Naval Medical Research Institute has these nifty rapid diagnostic assays, these little pregnancy test kind of things. And we can argue about the sensitivity, though it's not very good, or specificity, it's not very positive predictive value, it's awful. But suffice to say, that was a big advance forward from where we had been a few years previously. So they got these nifty rapid diagnostic assays, and they're going to be able to give us a preliminary idea of what's on those plates in a few hours. The mistake this postal clerk made, though, was he also alerted the D.C. municipal government. So they came with the fire engines, the police cars, and the ambulances, sirens blaring, lights flashing. They cordoned off most of downtown Washington. They initially decided to quarantine there were 100 people remaining in the building. They initially decided then to quarantine them in the building. Then somebody said, well, you know, if there's really anthrax in there, that's probably not a good idea. So they set up a decon station on Massachusetts Avenue. And they stripped the 100 people, men and women, down to their underwear. And they paraded them through bleach decon in 37-degree weather on Massachusetts Avenue in full view of the rolling CNN cameras. Now, I have mixed feelings for how things went down that day. On the one hand, that was probably overkill because, remember, biological agents have an important characteristic that conventional chemical and nuclear agents don't have. That's an incubation period, and that period varies from agent to agent, but for the vast majority of agents, it's at least 24 hours in duration. Yet we're going to have a preliminary idea in a lot less than that. And so probably a better way of handling this would have been keep everybody calm, don't decon anyone, go test the stuff. If it does look like anthrax, then we could decide which panic buttons we need to push and stuff. On the other hand, I was actually very pleasantly surprised that the D.C. municipal government had the wherewithal to operate what I would consider a very competent decon station. Now, most American cities could do that. Honolulu could easily do this nowadays, but back in 1997, that would not have been the case. So anyway, as it turns out, there were no pathogens at all on this plate. So here's a terrorist, and he's never been caught. Here's a terrorist who got everything he ever could have hoped for. He shut down the nation's capital of the United States of America at rush hour on a Friday with nothing, with an empty dish. And if he could do that with nothing, imagine what you could do with an eyedropper full of anything you could find in your hospital's laboratory and access to the salad bar at the inaugural ball, for example. So when we start talking about defending against that kind of threat, I think you can see that our challenges as public health and preparedness officials become pretty immense. So let's talk about this threat now. First question is, why would a terrorist bother with a biological weapon? Certainly history is full of examples like Oklahoma City here, or World Trade Center, Khobar Towers, USS Cole, Nairobi Embassy, and the list goes on and on and on, of terrorists attempting to achieve their aims using conventional weapons. Furthermore, thanks to the gang at the Aum Shinrikyo, we now know that terrorists have access to chemical weapons as well. Are you all familiar with the Aum Shinrikyo? Okay, so I'll talk. So anyway, this is... I don't remember what year it was, 98. The Aum Shinrikyo is a Japanese doomsday cult, and they released sarin, which is not a biological agent, it's a chemical agent, but they released sarin in the Tokyo subways, and 12 people died, which is certainly tragic. Even more problematic for the system, though, is there were 5,000 wounded well who completely clogged up the metropolitan Tokyo medical response system. So this is a scene from that, and you can see there in the lower left-hand corner is a dead guy. In the lower right-hand corner is a first responder. And you can see that that first responder is clothed in personal protective equipment. Now, we could spend a whole couple hours talking about personal protective equipment, the ins and outs, and so is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Well, just for the sake of argument, I would say that what he's wearing there is inadequate for chem, but it's overkill for bio. But suffice to say, he's got some personal protective equipment on, and we support that notion in a general sense at USAMRIID. So if we're going to send a first responder downrange, we want them in personal protective equipment. Here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the reporters and lawyers, and they are not in personal protective equipment, and we at USAMRIID support that notion as well. So given that terrorists have ready access to conventional and chemical weapons, why would anyone bother with a biological agent? Well, maybe we're a little bit biased at USAMRIID, but we would argue that these things are potentially the ultimate terrorist weapon. First of all, they're easy to procure. Any of you with 2 semesters of college microbiology training, which I suspect is a lot of you, could go right outside the door of this hotel, dig up a scoopful of dirt, and readily culture Clostridium botulinum, the causative agent of botulism. It's in the soil everywhere. In much of the continental United States, you could say the same thing for Bacillus anthracis, the causative agent of anthrax. These things are inexpensive to produce. We'll come back to that in a second. You can read all this as well as I can. I'll concentrate on a couple of these. These diseases have the ability to rapidly overwhelm medical capabilities. And the example I like to use of that notion is that of botulism. So botulism is a disease that still occurs naturally in this country. Every year we get about 100 to 120 case reports of human, mostly foodborne or infant botulism at the Centers for Disease Control. And yet you almost never hear of anyone dying anymore of botulism. And that's because in 2017, botulism is a survivable disease. Now, as an infectious disease doc, how would I manage you if you got botulism? Well, I'd probably have to put you on a ventilator. How long might you need to be on that ventilator? Perhaps as long as 7 months. Well, that's doable if I got 1 patient a year at Johns Hopkins and 1 at the Mayo Clinic and 1 at Walter Reed. That's not doable if I got 50,000 patients here in a single day in urban Honolulu. So you can imagine the human tragedy, not to mention the public relations nightmare that's going to occur when CNN gets wind of the fact that the governor of Hawaii could have stocked 50,000 ventilators in his go-to-war chest, but he didn't bother, and the health department didn't care, and blah, 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 blah. So, again, it's sometimes the bad guys might not even need to use these things. The simple threat of their use is enough to influence policy sometime at the highest levels. Remember, biological agents have an important characteristic that conventional chemical nuclear agents don't have. That's an incubation period. That period varies, but for the vast majority of agents, it's at least 24 hours in duration. Well, in this day of jet travel, I can be anywhere in 24 hours. So I can release my weapon. I can be safely back in, you name it, Pyongyang, Tehran, anywhere I want to be before anyone knows what hit them. So again, maybe we're a little bit biased, but we would argue that for all of these reasons, these things are probably the ultimate terrorist weapon. So I said we'd come back to this. In 1969, the United Nations commissioned a study looking at what it would cost a terrorist to produce mass casualties, and they defined that as 50% casualties over 1 square kilometer area. So these are $1969 figures. You can quadruple them to put them into current figures, but I think the ratios are instructive nonetheless. So if I wanted to produce mass casualties with a conventional weapon, it would cost me about $2,000. If I wanted to do that with a nuke, it would have cost me about $800. Now, I realize it costs a lot more than $800 to build a nuke, but you also get a lot more than 1 square kilometer worth of bang for your buck. If I wanted to do this like the Tokyo subway boys did with sarin, it would have cost me about $600, and if I wanted to do this with anthrax, it would have cost me about $1. So I don't think it's too difficult to see why at least a poorly funded terrorist group might look attractively at the biological terrorism option. In fact, that's what I want you to do right now. So for the last few minutes of this talk, I want you to put yourself in the role of the terrorist. So you're the terrorist. You're trying to decide which flavor of terrorism is best for me. And hopefully I've decided I've convinced you to take a serious look at the biological terrorism option. So now that you're a biological terrorist wannabe, the first question is, how are you going to get your hands on the agent? Well, I've already told you about 2 semesters of college microbiology. You can go out and grow this stuff yourself. But I'm now here to tell you that you don't even need that, because there are even easier ways to get your hands on these things. I don't know how many of you noticed it, but a lot of these diseases we're talking about, anthrax, tularemia, brucellosis, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, botulism, et cetera, those agents can produce disease in humans, but they don't do that very often. We get very few cases of human anthrax and human plague and human tularemia in this country. But those diseases are dirt common in animals. They're all zoonotic diseases. They're dirt common in animals. And consequently, veterinarians deal with those pathogens all the time. But I think you can imagine how tight security is at a veterinary clinic in small town Kansas, and how difficult it would be to get your hands on those agents. I want to focus, though, for a moment on this phenomenon of a multiple culture collection. So this is the front cover of a brochure from an organization known as the ATCC, the American Type Culture Collection. And they are our nation's repository for biological organisms. So when I did my infectious disease fellowship, I studied staph. And if I found a new property of a strain of staph, and I wanted to write about it for the medical literature, I would bank my strain with these guys so that other scientists could come along later and confirm or refute, mostly refute, my findings. If I wanted to work with the new strain of staph, I'd send them a check for 20 bucks and they'd send me a freeze-dried vial of staph. Well, just like I can get freeze-dried staph for 20 bucks, you can get freeze-dried plague for 20 bucks, and it's been done. So this gentleman on the left is Larry Wayne Harris. He was made famous by his arrest in Las Vegas in 1998 when he had anthrax in his trunk. Now, it turns out the anthrax was a harmless vaccine strain, non-pathogenic for humans, so they weren't able to convict him. But the whole reason they were following him in the first place was that 3 years previously, in 1995, he had been caught in Ohio with plague in his glove compartment. And he had gotten the plague in exactly that manner. He had ordered it from the ATCC. Now, I'm actually from Ohio originally. I lived in Texas for much of the past 30 years, but I grew up in Ohio, and I can tell you, at least back then, there's nothing illegal about having plague in your glove compartment in Ohio. But they were able to actually get him on a technicality, because on the order form they asked for your lab registration number. He didn't have one, so he used somebody else's. So they got him on a fraud conviction, and he got 25 hours of community service time. And since then, the CDC has stepped in, and we now have a select agent program, and it's a lot more difficult to get your hands on agents like that. But there are similar storehouses in 67 other nations from which you could order anthrax cultures and stuff. All right, so I've now told you why you should be a biological terrorist, how to get your hands on the agent. Next question is how you disseminate the agent. Well, this is another advertisement for a very legitimate peacetime device known as the Ag Pilatus Porter. And it's a commercial crop dusting device for legitimate crop dusting. You can't read it from there, but they advertise that they generate a spray of 2 to 6 microns in diameter. Well, that's perfect for reaching the human lower respiratory tract, because particles much smaller than 2 microns are exhaled as readily as they're inhaled. Particles much bigger than 6 microns get stuck in your boogers, but 2 to 6 microns is perfect for getting down to the lower lung and staying there. Also happens to be the size that anthrax spores can be milled to agglomerate in. So this is an absolutely perfect dissemination device for anthrax spores. Okay, so I've now told you why you should be a biological terrorist, how to get your hands on the agent, how to disseminate the agent. Next question is, which agent is best for you? Well, this is another study commissioned by the World Health Organization in 1970. They assumed one of these bad guys was flying a crop duster armed with 50 kilograms of agent along a 2-kilometer front upwind of a city of 500,000. So I'm initially from Cleveland. Cleveland's about 500,000. So this is what I could do to Cleveland with one of these agents. If you look in the third category there, if my goal was to kill as many people as possible, then there's no question my agent of choice is anthrax. Nothing else, nothing else has anywhere near the projected kill ratio of anthrax. Now, when this study was done, they didn't look at smallpox, and that would be the other one that would be right up there. And that just gets back to what we said earlier. If my goal is strategic, and going to want to fly the crop duster along the whole eastern seaboard and produce hundreds of thousands of casualties, then the good news is you're pretty much limited to anthrax and smallpox, and we are developing good countermeasures for those. Now, in this paradigm, tularemia actually looks like a pretty good second best, but this data was generated in 1970. Our antibiotics are a lot better nowadays, and nowadays I think most experts would consider tularemia an incapacitant rather than a lethal agent. Typhus looks like a good third best, but typhus is a rickettsial organism, virtually impossible to grow in the quantities necessary to do this. Same with tick-borne encephalitis virus. So what all that does is it serves to make the gap between anthrax and second best all that much greater. So if my goal is to kill people, it's anthrax or smallpox. On the other hand, if my goal is just to make a lot of people sick, get a lot of headlines, then there are clearly a lot of other things that can do that. All right, so I've now told you why you should be a biological terrorist, how to get your hands on the agent, how to disseminate the agent, a little bit about how to choose from amongst the various agents. Next question question is, how are you going to get this agent into your intended victim? Well, there are basically 3 routes of inoculation into the human organism. I'm getting the hook here, so I'm going to go through this real quick. So I can have these things penetrate your skin, just like they did with the Georgy Markov incident with the Maxwell Smart type spring-loaded umbrella gun. On the other hand, I can do this with a pistol and a silencer too, so I'm not sure what biological warfare gains you in this regard. Consequently, we don't worry about it too much. I used to not worry about it at all until in fact, I was guilty of writing in the medical literature that we don't have to worry about, and obviously there were some cases of cutaneous anthrax during the Mayo attacks of October of 2001. Fortunately, none of those patients died, but there was one pediatric case that I was peripherally involved in. I'm a pediatrician and infectious disease doc, but so this is the one child case of cutaneous anthrax that resulted in October of 2001. I think in the interest of time, we'll skip through this. Okay, so the next question is, can I wage oral biological warfare? Well, again, of course, and I told you about the 751 salad bar casualties. We'll talk about some other fascinating examples here real quick. So this is Ascaris suum. It is a pig tapeworm, or pig roundworm, rather. It's not normally pathogenic for humans, but there was a graduate student at the University of Montreal who was studying this as part of his graduate school studies. He had a disagreement with his roommates. It seemed his roommates felt he should share in the rent. He didn't think so. So he got some of these, the eggs of this worm, and he fed them in massive quantities, baked them into whatever, cooked them into his roommate's food, and they got sick with this roundworm. And so this just goes to show you, in the right hands, in the right quantities, virtually anything, I guess, could be a biological weapon. This is another great example. This woman was a laboratory technician. She had a disagreement with her coworkers. She decided to settle scores by getting a dozen jelly donuts, taking a syringe full of Shigella, and then injecting the centers of the jelly donuts. And then she left the box on the lunchroom table in the microbiology lab for her coworkers to partake of. She made 3 mistakes, though, at least 3 mistakes. So first, she sent an email out inviting everybody to partake of the donuts. So it wasn't too hard to figure out who brought the donuts. Second of all, she was the only one who knew the combination to the lunchroom door that didn't get sick. And third of all, there was a video camera in the room. So it wasn't too tough to catch her. This charming woman is actually a physician. You'll notice how most of these are medical people. So she tried to kill. She's a oncologist. She tried to kill her cardiologist husband by feeding him casseroles with rice and with castor beans baked into them and stuff. He didn't die, but he did get very sick, spent some time in an intensive care unit, had some of his small bowel removed. She then tried to kill him by burning their house down. He wasn't home, but unfortunately 2 of her 3 children perished in that fire, and she's serving a life sentence in Kansas City for that. I think in the interest of time, we'll go, it's our staple grains like barley, the heart and soul of American beer. So just when you thought it was safe to go out, now we finally got enough anthrax therapeutics for everybody in the country. We finally got a new generation smallpox vaccine, and we have enough of it for everybody in the country. We've tested the strategic national stockpile. We thought we were getting a handle on this, and along comes someone who proposes the unthinkable, taking out the beer industry. So it doesn't get any worse than that. With that said, that was the frightening example of anti-plant warfare I promised you earlier in the talk. With that said, I thank you very much for your attention. I think we're supposed to take a 15-minute break, right? Oh, a couple of questions. Okay. Any questions? I'll also be on the panel this afternoon, so if you don't think of them now.
Sure. Wow, what a great presentation, and this is only part 1 of part 2, so fantastic. Wow. Yeah, well, it's a good thing my teammates and my company, we love each other, so, no problems with the donuts and everything, okay? The fear thing, wow, that's incredible. Hey, this is an opportunity, again, after each topic, we'll have an opportunity for you guys to ask questions. So we have a microphone on that side of the room, and I also will be holding this microphone, so if you want to ask Colonel a question, please, by all means, step up to the microphone, or we can collect your paper and read that for you. Here we go. Anybody? Oh. I was going to say not all at one time, but here he is.
Okay, thanks, Fred.
Mark, go ahead.
Ted. I noticed that your listing of the Soviets' categories for threat agents. And I noticed that it was different actually from CDC's original Category A priority agent, which didn't include influenza. The Soviet list included influenza, and then now more recently, within the past couple of years, CDC has added that on. Can you speak to any of that issue?
Yeah, so what Mark's referring to is the Centers for Disease Control categorizes potential biological weapons into three categories: Category A, Category B, and Category C. And so Mark's asking about the differences or similarities between the CDC's classification system and the Soviet classification system that I showed you. So first thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the Soviets devised their system. First of all, they devised it, that reference that came from was a 1972 reference. So, you know, it's 45 years old now. Second of all, it was devised with warfare in mind, whereas the CDC system is designed with terrorism in mind. And again, those are somewhat different entities. The goal of a terrorist is not always to kill reasonably well-protected troops on the battlefield. It's sometimes just to create a lot of panic and havoc and gum up the system and stuff like that. So the CDC, I was actually part of that working group that devised the CDC system. And when we sat down to it, we started off by saying, you know, well, can we predict what a terrorist is most likely to use? Now, keep in mind, this was in the days before 9/11, so before terrorism was a big hot topic. And we concluded that no, you know, the actions of terrorists are too unpredictable. Many cases in the past, the terrorists used what we call the weapon of opportunity, something they could get their hands on. That was certainly the case with the Rajneeshis. They had salmonella available to them for some reason, and that's what they choose to use. Same with the woman with the Shigella and the jelly donuts. She worked in a lab. She happened to be able to get her hands on some Shigella, and so we kind of started with the assumption that, you know, can we predict what a terrorist is most likely to use? And we decided no. So then we said, well, how about we approach it this way? What, if used, would present the greatest challenge, the greatest obstacles to public health authorities? So that's how the CDC list grew up. It was those Category A agents: anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, botulism, and viral hemorrhagic fevers, and now influenza. Those are the agents, not necessarily that would be most likely to be used, but that if used would present the greatest challenges to public health authorities. And obviously some of those challenges, you know, are things that an organized state sponsor with a massive biological weapons program doesn't necessarily have to worry about. But long-winded answer, I apologize. Sir. You can shout it to me, I'll repeat the question.
Colonel, can you comment just on the relationship between the U.S. anthrax cases, Bruce Irvin's, and USAMRIID?
Yeah. So the question is, can I comment on the relationship between the anthrax attacks of October 2001 and Bruce Ivins, who is the person that the FBI ultimately pinned it on, and USAMRIID? I could go on for hours giving you, speculation and stuff. You may recall when the attacks first occurred, there was a first person of interest named Stephen Hatfill, who had a very interesting background. He was a legitimate, he was a physician. He had gotten his degree in Rhodesia. Rhodesia at the time he got his degree was a client state of South Africa and was going through the same apartheid struggles, and there were allegations that the white Rhodesian government had used anthrax against the black Zimbabwean rebels, and et cetera, a lot of racial overtones and stuff to those allegations. And he had trained in that, he had gotten his MD degree in Rhodesia in that at that era, and there were a lot of other, concerning things in his background. And initially, the FBI had him as the person of interest and followed him around for a couple of years. You may remember an FBI agent actually ran over his foot because they were parked out in front of his house and tailing him so closely, and he won a successful lawsuit against the FBI. And then a few years later, this Bruce Ivins became a person of interest. He was another legitimate scientist, PhD microbiologist. By all accounts, I didn't know him really when I worked there. I knew who he was, and so you'd see him in the hallway once in a while. Very soft-spoken, quiet guy, and that's who the FBI, has ultimately settled on as the guilty culprit. I know talking to former USAMRIID commanders, they believe he probably was the guilty party as well. And there's some reasons to think he certainly was a troubled character and had some emotional and psychological baggage, which now brings up the question: well, should he have been working in a facility like that if he's got this emotional baggage? And it brings up the whole issue of how do you, the psychological surety issue that is so difficult to get your arms around. I will say there are a lot of folks there who don't think he could have been the one to do it. There's some troubling issues surrounding his guilt or innocence too, namely that this anthrax he supposedly milled was so well milled that it, could come out of envelopes and, as they went through postal machines and stuff, and was very gaseous in its behavior properties and stuff. And yet they were never able to find a single spore on any of his clothing, car, home, furniture, anything. And so there's some people who feel like there's absolutely no way he could have made that much anthrax and not have a single telltale spore on anything or something. So there's some open-ended questions there. But I think the leadership at USAMRIID feels he probably was the troubled character who did this. And his motive, I have no idea. If I had to speculate, back when that happened, there had been a lot of, this was conceived of pre-9/11. It actually followed the attacks on 9/11 by 3 weeks. But I'm sure it was all conceived of prior to 9/11, so prior to there being a lot of emphasis on terrorism. And there had been a lot of money spent on biodefense. The CDC project to generate that list was done in 1998, 1999. And by 2001, the funding and stuff was starting to fall off, federal funding for biodefense, and they were starting to emphasize dirty bombs and nuclear. And, it's speculated that maybe he wanted to convince the government that, they were wrong to be cutting the funding and they needed to take this threat seriously. The friends who knew him feel he probably, if he was the guilty one, and most of his friends don't feel he was, but if he was the guilty one, he didn't intend to kill anyone. He was mortified that people actually died. He rather had intended to just make a point that these things were viable weapons. But that's all speculation on my part. I probably said way too much.
Any other questions? Again, this is part one of part two, so at this time, if no other questions, we're going to dismiss you for a break real quickly. We've got refreshments in the back, our two favorite. We've got blueberry and strawberry yogurt up back there. So please help yourself with granola, refresh your beverages. We'll be back at 10:30 to start the second session of Colonel. How about a nice round of applause for Colonel?